and this is the 94th episode of the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. And today, Scott, I'd like to welcome you back to the program. This is, I believe, your third one. Now you're a popular speaker for us, and you share a great wealth of information, both on the technique and some of the history and biology of these species that you talk about. So we really appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks for having me back, Benji. It's great to have a good audience here. We're going to talk today about something I'm pretty excited about, making plans myself to do some ice fishing as our lakes open up for lakes that aren't entirely within the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. We'll talk about that in just a second. So there's a lot of content. I know that's one thing. We kind of throw the kitchen sink at you here. It's really everything. It's kind of a one-stop shopping, I'd like to call it. Try to talk for 40 or 45 minutes and leave 10 or 15 minutes for questions at the very end. We welcome questions throughout the presentation or at the end, but this is designed to get folks up off the ground, to get out and do some ice fishing for lake trout. Take it off your bucket list, do it. And then for folks that are experienced, I know we have some folks that have signed up for this webinar. We have folks that are avid ice anglers, particularly for trout, and they may pick up on that. I know a friend of mine, Steve Foss, up in Ely, Minnesota, is going to be on the call. I'm going to give him a little shout out because I am a big advocate of trying to share the outdoors with others. I think Steve is a great example of that. He guides for lake trout in that area and is willing to help folks who are not his clients with getting out and fishing for lake trout. So with that, I am an area supervisor at the Hutchinson Department of Natural Resources Fisheries Office. I've been an avid ice angler since I was a young kid, but growing up in southern Minnesota, didn't get a chance to chase lake trout until my college years. I caught my first lake trout while walking out and setting up on Caribou Lake near Marcel. Then in the years that followed, I fished with friends on some weekend trips to Burnside Lake near Ely. These days, you'll find me chasing lake trout along the Gunflint Trail in Cook County, northeastern Minnesota, or in cold years on Lake Superior. I'm going to highlight the link, and Benji's going to provide it as well, that I was one of the authors on guidance for lake trout ice fishing seen in this link right here. And while I only get to chase lake trout a few times each year, I thoroughly enjoy each trip and hope to share what I've learned with others, just as others have shared what they know with me. Speaking of sharing with others, did you know that this weekend is not only the lake trout winter opener, but take a kid ice fishing weekend. Please find a reason to get a kid outdoors and onto the ice, not just this weekend, but throughout the year. Adults can fish for free while taking out a kid that's 15 years old or younger for the entire weekend. So take those kids ice fishing. All right, some of the topics we're going to cover today, we're going to talk a little bit about ice safety. We'll run through that, why it's appropriate for lake trout and lake trout fishing. We're going to talk a little bit about lake trout biology. We'll talk about where are the lake trout opportunities in Minnesota. We'll specifically highlight where to fish on lakes, specific locations that you can try when you're fishing on lake trout waters. We'll talk a little bit about the differences in inland lakes versus fishing on Lake Superior and that special opportunity for fishing lake trout on Lake Superior through the ice. We'll talk a bit about rigging and gear, and we'll go through a lot of probably what many of you signed up for, which are kind of fishing techniques, equipment, what you'll need, and where to go, that kind of thing. And then finally, we'll close off with preparing lake trout for meals and a little bit on lake trout conservation before we open it up at the end for any questions. So hitting off on ice safety. So I did make a distinction. I want to make it real clear for everyone right out of the gate. We do have two different openers for lake trout in the state of Minnesota. If you are fishing in waters that are entirely within the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, those open on January 1st. However, for lakes that are not entirely within the Boundary Waters Canoe Area, that is typically the second Saturday, I believe it's written in law. As it stands, it's this year on January 14th of 2023, and they run through the final day of March. That is the season, the winter season for lake trout. There's that closure. Lake trout are a fall spawning fish, so there is that closure in the fall that leads into the winter and through the first part of January. Winter season, because of that, we're talking about winter seasons and ice fishing. You can really have dangerous weather conditions, not only during the angling portion, but especially during travel. Typically, I'm looking at a long-term weather forecast. I've been doing that for the past week, anticipating what's coming this weekend, and especially on the travel portion of it. The other thing worth pointing out, and we'll see this in a map representation, is the range of lake trout is across extreme north and northeast Minnesota on large and deep lakes. And if you know much about how lakes freeze, the shallower a lake is, the quicker it's going to freeze up. The deeper it is, the longer it's going to take. For that reason, these are some of the last lakes that freeze up. As you go out for lake trout opener, and throughout the season, you need to be aware of thin ice, particularly in certain locations. Slush is a major issue around the state this year, and that slush can be very deadly from a safety perspective. It can overtop or cover your boots, cover your pants, bibs, outerwear. It can add weight when it freezes on your snowmobile or freezes onto a fish house. And these locations that you'll see on the map are notorious for spotty cell service. So I mentioned that some of these lakes are located in the Boundary Waters canoe area. When you're entering those areas to fish for lake trout and you're planning a trip in there, you need to think about, do you have the wilderness skills and equipment to get in and out? Are you prepared to winter camp? There are many folks that will sled in, snowshoe, or ski in, and they will winter camp and spend time out there. Are you prepared for that? If you're not, it can be a very deadly situation with exposure, frostbite, hypothermia. These lakes I mentioned, they're very large. They can access challenges. Again, weather conditions tie into that. It might be just fine when you start the day off, and then it could get stormy. You could have lots of winds whipping up. You may start the day off and it's just fine, and then you have a huge cold front that comes in. There was one time I was fishing, the temperature dropped 30 or 40 degrees in a day, and everything that was slushy turned rock hard. Other times I've been out where the day starts off very pleasant, then the wind kicks up, pushes all the snow around, and you end up getting a whiteout or a ground blizzard. So just beware of these conditions. They can happen on big waters, especially. And then Lake Superior is particularly challenging for ice fishing. When ice forms on the lake, those conditions can change daily. You do need a bitter cold snap to form that ice, but that ice can be lost very quickly through wind and wave activity. Ice flows where ice breaks off with people on the ice can happen. They're frequent, they're dangerous. You have to really be careful for those. When we do get ice that comes on, if people go out too early, that's typically the news reports that you see on this, on the stories that you see on news reports of folks that are stranded on Lake Superior. Consult local bait shops for the latest reports and watch those weather forecasts. And make sure whether you're going ice fishing for lake trout or anything else, you're always going to bring your safety gear with you. Ice picks, a throw rope, early season, bring that spud bar. Try to wear that floating ice suit or bring along a life jacket. Make sure that you have a plan. Where are you going? When are you going to get out? Share that plan with your loved ones. Make sure your family and friends know where you're going. It's advantageous to use a buddy system. Make sure that you are traveling with others that can help you out. And really, most importantly, whether it's just heading out, walking out a short distance, or going way far in, don't go further than your capabilities, experience, and knowledge allow you. All right, a little bit on lake trout biology. So, lake trout, they're cold water thermal niche fish. What does that mean? Well, lake trout require cold, well oxygenated water. That's typical of oligotrophic Canadian Shield type lakes. What is oligotrophic? Those are those really deep, really rocky, clear water, the kind of lakes that you can see down 20 feet in, the beautiful lakes we think of with the Hams beer commercials or what have you, really northern Minnesota and into Canada. For lakes to possess lake trout, they have to contain big areas of deep water that gets cold, as well as having adequate spawning and nursery habitat and suitable forage for lake trout. Lake trout are members of the char genus Salvelinus. So other trout or other char that you'll find in North America include brook trout. You can find them here in Minnesota. And then there's also bull trout, Dolly Varden, and Arctic char, which you will not find in Minnesota. Here's a big one that relates to angling. Lake trout are physostomus. What is physostomus? Physostomus is referring to lake trout having gas bladders that allow them to gulp air and process it through a pneumatic duct, allowing them to quickly move up and down the water column while inflating or deflating that gas bladder. So this is seen very commonly. Lake trout are observed releasing gas from their air bladders when anglers are reeling them in. You'll often see those bubbles come up when the fish is being fought and landed on hook and line. In fact, recently, a fishing friend of mine kind of called lake trout by a unique name. He calls them burp sharks, because when you're catching them, they're like little freshwater sharks swimming around, aggressive predators, and then when you're reeling them up the hole, they're often burping that air out. So burp sharks, kind of a unique way to name them. Lake trout are top level predators. Their primary prey in most systems are ciscos, which are also called tulaby or lake herring. They go by a few different common names. But lake trout are also known to feed on frogs, crayfish, shiners, sculpin, young burbot or eel pout, and introduced rainbow smelt, all as available and abundant. Typically, most abundant in most systems that contain lake trout are ciscos. They do possess a pyloric ceca. The pyloric ceca, you can see in the photo here. These are folds along the intestinal cavity that excrete digestive enzymes and increase surface area for digestion. These specialized features are unique to a small number of predaceous species of fish and their families. If you're looking around in Minnesota, you'll see pyloric ceca in burbot, or also known as eel pout, in freshwater drum or sheephead, and lake trout. And lastly, kind of an interesting tidbit, lake trout muscle tissue is influenced by diet. In your harvested lake trout, you may see pale yellow, light pink, or reddish flesh, all dependent upon prey type. So there's many carotenoid pigments that are found in certain crustaceans. And the larger the part of the diet that crustaceans are, the more pigmentation you'll find in the flesh. Essentially, you are what you eat. A bit more. Lake trout are behaviorally a non-schooling species with pelagic roaming tendencies. However, this is the great thing about going out and fishing and what you get to see when you make observations. It is not uncommon to see and mark on your electronics more than one fish attacking your bait. So there might be some sort of behavioral symbiosis in this pack hunting approach. What I mean by that is a couple of lake trout might try to work together really in a stalk and ambush behavior, right? If they're chasing these roaming schools of ciscos around the lake, it makes sense for them to work with another partner that might push into the school of ciscos, knock a couple loose that are running around on their own, and they're a little easier then for a pair working together to chase them down. Other tidbits: the Minnesota State record lake trout, 43 pounds 8 ounces, caught in Lake Superior up in the Cook County area. And interesting, all of our lake trout, I mentioned this about the season closure, they're fall spawners, and they're usually spawning at nighttime. We sometimes have questions from folks about splake. And I'm mentioning this in the realm of lake trout biology because a splake is actually a hatchery hybrid, not something you would find in nature. It's a cross between a female lake trout and a male brook trout. And one of the most interesting things for those of us that work in fisheries science, this is always an exciting topic as we learn more and more about it, is Lake Superior produces 4 different morphotypes of lake trout. You can see them in this photo. So these morphotypes live in different depths. They utilize different habitats, and they have some differentiation in body shape and in their fin adaptations for their movement and locomotion. So at the top of the photo, you'll see a lean lake trout. Then there's a humper, a ciscoette, and a redfin. So the ciscoette and redfins tend to hang out in very deep water. The lean lake trout is what you're going to see and catch in inland waters, as well as making up the majority of the catch for sport anglers on Lake Superior. The humpers are usually found in shallow water habitats. That's all relative, of course, on Lake Superior with its massive depth, but on shallow water habitats that include reefs that are spread across the lake, where they're feeding primarily on crustaceans. So research is continuing on these incredible within species differences, checking out these different morphotypes across Lake Superior and the Great Lakes. So where are the opportunities to fish for lake trout in Minnesota? Because of those specialized habitat needs that we've talked about, lake trout are found in very few lakes in Minnesota, and we're really on the southern end of their continental distribution. So we actually have 110 lakes in Minnesota. You can see that in that map here. And think about it, we are in a state with over 11,000, close to 12,000 lakes that are over 10 acres, and only 110 of those contain lake trout. So obviously the real big one is Lake Superior, but then elsewhere in the Arrowhead, spread across north central Minnesota, our southernmost lake trout lake is Grindstone off of Interstate 35 in the Hinckley area, and then we have a few scattered Crow Wing County, Itasca County, Cook Lake, and St. Louis County. And so a fair amount across the north and northeast Minnesota. All right, so we're going to break down where would you fish on these lake trout waters. We're really going to look for some classic structures. It's structure fishing that are going to be higher percentage places to intercept lake trout. And we're going to use a remote scouting tool. Benji's going to provide this link to you. It's the free Navionics web app. This is a great chance if you want to do some remote scouting for any lakes across the state. This is a great chance to plug it in and pull up your favorite lakes and kind of see some of the bathymetry and where the structure is located. And I think the big thing is we did talk about they're pelagic. You know, you could catch them anywhere. I've caught lake trout out in the middle of lakes in the middle of nowhere, where conceivably they could be anywhere. I mean, the temperature is uniform enough in the winter; they could be about anywhere. But I think you really up your odds by working with structural elements in lakes to try to find places because again, they're predators and they're looking for prey. So what better spot to find them than places they want to ambush prey? So underwater humps, also known as sunken islands or reefs. So what are so great about these? Well, we have access to we have access to deeper water nearby here. It's just a structural element that's coming up, and really what I like about this particular hump is it's great to fish where there is that deeper water, where they're coming out of the deeper water and you've got access to it relatively quickly. I mean, you can see these break lines where the contours change. It happens very fast. It just rises up. We love those types of places because again, think about that predatory behavior. They may be driving up on a prey item, pushing it against something, stopping it from fleeing or getting away. So I would fish on 3 sides of this hump that we're listing here on Burnside Lake, trying to face the deeper water. Not to say you couldn't catch them anywhere else. Points make a lot of sense on some of our lakes. So some of these lakes are very steep sided, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Just you may find lakes that are just a perfect oval or a perfect circle that goes completely deep. Where you do find points, those can be places to intercept fish. Think of these fish as roaming. They can go in any direction, but a lot of times they are following depth contours. They're moving from a deep spot to a shallow spot. When you're hanging on a point like this, fish are probably cruising past this location. And really, it can be an onshore feature in this case at this point on Daniels Lake, or it could be an underwater point, which sometimes get referred to as a finger. You can see the access to deep water. So really anywhere ahead of this point, maybe you pick a particular depth. If you start in 30 or 40 feet and set up there, you're likely to encounter some fish that are moving through. All right, we'll talk a little bit about neck downs. These are natural pinch points. If I zoomed out on this map of Seagull Lake, you could see in a greater context how this leads fish to making a choice as they navigate around the lake. If they're forced to pass through a small area, you just have a better chance of encountering fish. So we have a nice little neck down through here. And it's lodged between 2 other structural features we just talked about, right? It's lodged between a point right here and a hump out here. So you have a choice of features to fish on this location. You can fish the hump, you can fish the point, or you can sit in this neck down and see some fish come through there as well. So another structural element for you to check out when you're fishing for lake trout. All right, so I did mention we may have some lakes that they don't have these really obvious features. They may not have any reefs that you can fish on whatsoever. That's where a lot of times you want to get on what we call a sharp break line or a drop off, or looking at the bathymetry or the depth contours of the lake, trying to find where they drop very quickly. Sometimes you don't get a lot of features to work with, and you want to do what you can to go somewhere. You know, if you can find a location where if you have these fast drops, but you find a shelf that's adjacent to it where it's flat for a little bit before it drops down, those shelves are good places to go. If I'm fishing in this Brainerd area mine pit, I may pick a depth contour of 50, 60 feet that's adjacent to deeper water down here. There's a fast break. I may hang along a straightaway here. I may go where it's more sloping on this side. I'm just going to kind of pick a drop off location and fish it. Maybe it's up here on the north. Find a depth, and I can move around a little bit throughout the day. Maybe I go shallower, maybe I go deeper, but I'm hanging on those drop offs and those break lines and just seeing if something's going to cruise through. And lastly, I did mention we would talk a little bit about Lake Superior. So you're on these inland lakes and you know where to fish. Superior really is just a whole different animal. You can't be as choosy about where you go because you just have that small window when it's safe and there's enough ice. And typically that isn't happening until you get into February or March. It requires that good cold spell. So while there are some nearshore reefs and spots that are popular and they often become a race for the locals to reach first, I do think your best idea in all reality is to find safe ice, get away from other people, and just be quiet. Lots of noise and commotion on the ice is not a good recipe for catching any sort of fish. And keeping in mind too that you're not going to have the same amount of ice on Lake Superior as you're going to have on inland lakes. It's going to be much thinner. You may have anywhere from 4 to 8, as much as 10 inches potentially in the really cold years. But that 4 to 8 inch range is probably what you're talking about, and it's thin. Fish can hear through it. So I've had my best success on Lake Superior, getting away from other people, being quiet, and just kind of going about my business and marking a lot of fish that came through. It's really kind of exciting. All right, so let's get to what a lot of folks probably set up to talk about or wanted to talk about today, which is rigging and gear, the how-to aspect of lake trout fishing. Just wanted to point a couple things out, and I know we've got notes we'll pass out on this. I think I saw Benji already shared the fishing regulations synopsis link. If you haven't already, get a paper copy of that synopsis, keep it in your tackle box or in your vehicle, or save it to your smartphone in the PDF version so you can always reference it. A couple things to mention here. So when you're fishing lake trout through the ice, you can use 2 lines on inland waters and on Lake Superior. However, if you are chasing stream trout, brook trout, rainbow trout, brown trout that have been stocked into lakes, if you're chasing stream trout, you may only use 1 line. You may not possess or use live or dead minnows on stream trout lakes, but you can use live or dead minnows on lake trout lakes. So make sure you're looking up exactly what kind of trout you're fishing for and what water you're going on to. We do have some resources for looking that up as well. And I do want to spend some time talking about bait because it is an important part of chasing after lake trout. And a lot of it, there's a lot to go over here. To be honest, we could do a whole talk on bait and bait laws. This is where you're going to need to do a little bit of homework on your own. We'll share the link with you. You can see it in the slide here. Bait is very popular when fishing for lake trout. On the days when fish are really aggressive, you probably don't need bait whatsoever. But when the bite is more marginal and if it's really finicky, it does help trigger strikes. Having some bait is useful. And again, this is a piscivorous species. It's primarily eating other fish species. It does eat some crustaceans like we talked about. But having bait can be important for that. So know before you go, what are the bait laws that are out there? I'm going to hit on a couple of them that are going to be pertinent to our lake trout anglers. So a few of the most popular baits out there: Cisco, smelt, frozen emerald or spot tail shiners, blunt nose and fathead minnows that you'd buy at a bait shop. These are all VHS susceptible species. So if you capture your own bait, before the winter season, or if you trap through the ice, it must be done in VHS-free zones from non-infested waters, and you can possess and have no more than a gross of minnows, which are 12 dozen, 144. However, most people buy their bait, which when buying, you should be looking for VHS-free, tested and packaged bait, and keep the receipt. I think across the northeastern part of the state where most of our lake trout waters are, if you're stopping into bait shops in those areas, that's what you're going to see for sale. If you're going through Ely Tower, if you're heading up through Two Harbors and Duluth, if you're heading up to Grand Marais, or those areas, you're going to see VHS tested, free tested and packaged bait. Make sure you're keeping that receipt. Other non-VHS susceptible bait options that are popular include white suckers, dace, which go by the bait trade name rainbows, golden shiners, creek chubs, and horny head chubs. And the bait trade name for the horny head chubs are, I'm blanking, are red tails, excuse me. So just here's a picture of a few of those to give you a little visual representation of what they look like. But why all the VHS laws, VHS susceptible bait option laws? Well, it's really designed to stop the spread of that virus, right? It's viral hemorrhagic septicemia. It has been documented in Great Lakes states, including in Lake Superior. So we do know that it's out there. We don't want to spread it. It's been likened by pathologists to the Ebola virus for fish. Michigan and parts of Wisconsin have dealt with it in some of their waters where they've had huge mortality events with the VHS susceptible species. So not something we want to bring into Minnesota, hence the reason for the bait laws. But if you're mindful of that, keeping your receipt, buying VHS free packaged baits, you'll be in pretty good hands. And I know it can seem like a lot of regulation. It's designed for the health and benefit of our natural resources. And I would challenge folks, compare our bait laws to the Canadian provinces where they're much more challenging. All right, so let's talk a bit about fishing techniques. I think I'm going to break it down into a couple different ways to go about it. Starting off, we're going to talk, because we have the option in Minnesota for fishing 2 lines in the winter and on lake trout waters, passive angling using tip ups or tip downs. So lake trout are top level predators, but like most top predators in the animal kingdom, efficiency is really the name of the game for them. And if they don't have to expend a lot of energy to find a meal, they're going to take advantage. So for that reason, live baits and dead baits work really well for lake trout on tip ups or tip downs. I've got some pictures here. So we've got, this is a tip down. We've got a traditional tip up, and then I've got a tip up pictured here that has a rod that fits into it. So as far as rigging on your tip ups and tip downs, you can run braid for the main line with a larger breaking strength, say 20 pounds or better, and then attach that braided main line to a fluorocarbon leader with a quick strike rig. So we do have in your regulation synopsis, page 29 of the synopsis, you'll see what that quick strike rig looks like, or it describes it a little bit. Basically, it's a single tackle configuration where we're going to have treble hooks that we can hook up to a live or dead bait, and we can have up to 3 of them, but they can't exceed 9 inches in length on that rig on a wire, basically. That's just going to be a way to put a hook in that fish and prevent them from swallowing it all the way down. It's a good thing to use for the fish. I do like using fluorocarbon leaders just because these lake trout live in deep, cold, and clear water, and that water clarity and the fish's excellent vision might be enough reason to deter bites if you just use a straight wire. Fluorocarbon has a lower refractive index, and it really closely lines up with water, which makes it look invisible. It's hard to see underwater versus, you know, the heavy braid on the main line is something they'd be able to see. So the advantage of that rod holding tip up or tip down is just having that rod for the, you know, to fight the fish with. These are fish. These lake trout make powerful runs, and you will at times have to give line back and in a hurry. Keeping tension with a rod is a lot easier than looping braid off the ice in cold water. That's kind of the advantage of putting the rod, you know, in a tip up holder like that. So I just saw the question pop up about length of leader. You know, one or two rod lengths potentially. You know, I think these rod lengths are shorter, obviously in the wintertime. So as little as 3 feet, as much as 6 feet, you can kind of play around with that. Just make sure you've got a good connecting knot between your main line and your leader. All right, now let's move on to probably what a lot of folks have questions on, and that's the active angling and jigging. So real quickly, I'll address, we did have a question about automatic fishermen, jaw jackers. I can share with you, you know, the question is, well, why do we have these rules in place that Minnesota is this one state that we don't allow hook setting devices on tip ups, tip downs, that sort of thing? Really, I don't have the answer for, you know, why it was set up that way. It's a bit of an antiquity going back into the past, what people thought fair chase laws should be. I can share with you that there are some internal discussions about changing that, potentially through the rulemaking processes. So maybe I've said too much by saying that, but I could see it. I could see it something changing in the years where we're going to fall more in line with our neighboring states. So there is hope for folks that want to use those devices in the future. Um, I'll try to pop in on some other questions when we get to the end, but thanks for those. So active jigging in the active angling throughout the year using or through the ice season is jigging here. So think about it this way. In the summer, you can cast and troll for lake trout to cover water and find fish. But in the winter, you need to set up in a good location and coax a lake trout underneath you to attack your bait. There are a few bites in ice fishing that are more exciting than a lake trout smashing your bait. Because these fish are top level predators, they're incredible hunters, and seeing and experiencing those behaviors is really exhilarating. Um, whether you, if you're using forward facing or down facing sonar, you can watch a lake trout enter the periphery of the spot that you're fishing, lock onto your bait, and when it strikes that fish's nerve and they commit to eat, you can actually see that fish hunting down and ultimately ambushing your bait. Many times you're going to play a game of cat and mouse, retrieving a bait, dropping a bait, going up and down the water column. You might do that several times to with your heart kind of racing the whole time just to trigger that strike. So strikes are best known for being sharp and hard, but on some days, fish behavior, you see it if you do any amount of angling. Fish behavior is changing day to day, weather conditions, time of year, metabolism, what have you. You can see great differences. Some days they're just snapping out there, very aggressive. Other days it can be very soft and the bite can be very fickle. So you can attempt to downsize your lures. You can go all the way down to small walleye jigs, little tiny pieces of bait on there, cutting them smaller and smaller. I even have a friend of mine that when it gets this tough, he puts wax worms on the tips, and he swears that that's it's like fishing for panfish. It's like all he can get a fish to commit to when the bite is off. So while most of us enjoy and look forward to and associate lake trout fishing with those hard smashing strikes, and hopefully you all get to experience them, there are days it's a little tougher. But that's the bit on jigging. I'll go into the equipment. We will still spend some time talking about jigging. So recommending for you folks to get a rod in the 30 to 45 inch length range, medium through heavy power, fast or moderate action. Make sure you're using large eyelets, those guides on your rod if you fish outside so you don't get frozen up. The length of the rod is going to give you more leverage and provide some hook setting power. You don't want a wimpy rod like a soft walleye or perch rod to try to set the hook into a hard mouth of a lake trout. Let's make sure that you tailor the power to the size of the fish that you're chasing. Most folks are tangling with eating size lake trout that are a few pounds to as large as 10. If you get onto bigger water or take a trip to a more remote location with big fish present, you might consider heavier power. The action refers to the bend along the rod's entire length and how it loads. You want a good bend in the rod, not just the tip, because that bend and flex is what is providing forgiveness for every head shake, run, and darting movement made during the fight and at the hole. Many fish are lost at the hole. The minute your rod is straightened out, you don't have that forgiveness. If you use too strong of a rod, you run that risk. But if you hook a large fish and you have too soft of a rod, then you're in for a long fight with little leverage or stopping power. On the reel side of things, bait casting or spinning reels, just don't use inline reels. I say that just because I had some family members show up at our lake trout trip that are using the inline reels. Those are designed for pan fishing, really not for depths over 20 feet. They're there because you don't have, so you're not introducing line twist. I know that they're gearing those up a little bit, but I would still advise against inline reels. You need reels to have a high quality adjustable drag and have large arbors, right? Have a big spool on your bait cast or spinning reel so that you can hold a lot of line. When we're talking about, my preference of monofilament, that's going to be a wider diameter than braid. It means you got to have room to put it all on there. So you can use those bait feeding spinning reels on rod holding tip ups or tip downs. If you've used bait feeders, basically it's a way to still have your reel engaged, but let the drag slip and let line come out with little tension, and you hear the clicking as the bait feeder runs line out. For line, I do like to run 8 to 12 pound monofilament. I just prefer that stretch forgiveness. It's kind of like I just got done telling you about wanting to have that bend in the rod that gives you forgiveness. You get a certain amount of grace and forgiveness in the stretch of monofilament. Um, so you can go larger if you plan to tangle with larger fish. A small note about this slide. You'll notice the grip on the rod there. A note about grips: you cannot pencil grip these rods to set the hooks. So the photo was taken to kind of show the slush in the background, but you can still see an overhand grip. A fish comes, you want to be able to quickly turn your wrist, turn your elbow, and get a hook set. Use that leverage to your advantage to set that hook home. All right, let's talk a bit about fishing lures. There's a lot of them. We talk about active fishing and jigging, and we've got lots to cover. We'll get through a few of those here. So first, we'll go through airplane jigs. These can be baited. You may put some live or dead fish or fish parts on there. They can have plastic or hair trailers. Sometimes you'll see a stinger hook attachment. A couple of these have those stinger hooks on there. And those stinger hook attachments really help with short bites. I like my jigs heavy. That's personal preference. My smallest is like 3/4 of an ounce. I want them to drop like a rock because we're typically fishing deep. And kind of what I said earlier about how we're in deep water and these fish go up and down the water column chasing your bait. I want it to really look like it's trying to get away from that fish and it's dropping down, racing for the bottom. So I like a heavy bait. Some days they may want something slower, and we do have options in our tackle box that work that way. But again, these are visual predators. Everything that we're throwing down there is designed to get their attention, for them to be able to see it from a distance. And a big thing I think you're going to see is color and pattern, flash, a lot of whites and silvers. Again, because we're trying to compare against what they're eating out there. So speaking of that, tube jigs. Tube jigs have probably accounted for more lake trout caught in the winter than any other lure. Favorite colors are white and clear with silver glitter flecks, and that's resembling Cisco's and those shiny fish, Cisco's, maybe even smelt. You're gonna find the biggest tubes you can get, maybe even go a size bigger, right? Try and find 1-ounce jig heads. That's my personal preference, and make sure they have high quality hooks that you're able to drive that hook point home. This is a tip not just for lake trout, but for any fishing that you're doing. Take that hook, rub it on the point of it on the top of your fingernail. Make sure it's catching. If it's catching, it's nice and sharp, but if it slides right across, you've got a dull hook. So make sure you're using sharp hooks when you're fishing for lake trout and they're hard mouths. I'm lucky to have a friend of mine in Colorado, who molds jig heads for me. Flutter spoons. I mentioned, hey, we might want to slow things down and not have something sink like a rock. These are great baits to throw out to make things fall a little more slowly, deceptively. They've got that shimmering side to side action as they go down, and that throws a lot of light. That catches light, makes that flash quite a bit up and down the water column. It's a nice bait for getting the attention of those fish, and maybe on days they don't want it going, sinking super fast. This might be your answer. Then we've got heavy jigging spoons. A lot of options with these. Some of them glow in the dark. Some of them have rattles. Some have a hammered finished again, so you can cast light in a lot of different directions. But they're all going to flash and wobble. I call them heavy jigging spoons just because I want the ones again that sink like a stone when you need them to drop in a hurry. So we've got lots of heavy jigging spoon options out there. Another option, I have just one, if you can make it out dead center, is a swim bait. They're more and more popular. I have more in my summer boxes, but I haven't really rated them for the winter yet. These are soft plastic bodies that are molded around a jig or a weighted hook. They have exceptional realism. The example I have here looks very much like a round goby, which is an invasive fish in the Great Lakes, but also looks like our native sculpin. So they have exceptional realism. They usually come with paddle or curly tails. They have this really great realistic swimming action. So that's one of those, match the hatch, make it look like whatever the local prey type is, and dart that bait around, swim it around. It's got great swimming action. Hard baits are a very popular lure. They have also caught many lake trout. So they have a bait fish profile. You can give them dancing, jigging strokes. You can be the puppeteer up there that's running these things, and you may drop them up and down over huge swaths of water, or you may do these short jigging strokes. You're going to have to read your fish when they come in, and you're jigging something. They come in. You can take it away from them to elicit that predatory instinct, or if they're totally locked in on your bait, you can try to take it away from them. But if they just want to sit and stare at it, sometimes you have to play with it a little bit, right? You can work these hard baits when you're in close quarters with a lake trout by just slowly running it up and down and giving it kind of a bucking bronco action with these small rhythmic drops. So that's something I'm just going to say about active fishing and jigging in general is there's a learning curve for everybody here that's doing it for the first time or that's done it for 30 years is trying to key in on what they want. Do they want big aggressive movements? Do they want small movements? How does that bait look? The best thing you can do whenever you're jigging through an ice hole is drop that bait down in the water about 6 inches and look at it. Start working it in the hole, see what it looks like. So when it's 30, 40 feet below you, you still know what it's going to look like down there. If you don't know how to impart really good action to it before you start, you don't want to do it blindly. You want to know what it takes to move that bait effectively before you start putting it in front of a fish. Blade baits are a final one to mention here. You see it highlighted there. So this is a great lure to get outside of your, it's everything is being presented vertically, but this is a bait we can move horizontally, just like an airplane jig, is designed to swim outside of the hole. These blade baits, they have excellent vibration and wobbling, they have heavy weighted bottom cores to drop quickly, and they just have this erratic swimming action. So you can get them outside of that hole in a hurry. A final note about these lures, most of them will introduce some level of twist to your line. It's really in your best interest to run to a small barrel swivel to keep your baits from spinning when you come to a stop in front of a trout. I prefer very small profile but heavyweight rated barrel swivels. The small profile allows them to pass through my tip-top guide and onto my rod when I run longer leaders. Again, I said it once already, trout are visual predators. These lures are all designed on triggering strikes. On days that they're gun shy, try tipping the bait with bait and downsizing. On other days, work it very aggressively. See what they want. Just some other notes here on fishing equipment that is necessary. I'll say electronics, not necessary per se, but your catch rate as documented in our angler surveys the catch rates are markedly better for anglers who use electronics. So we're talking flashers, right? Flashers like Vexilar or Markham, Humminbird, other companies make them, LCD displays on Lowrance and Humminbird. A flasher is useful for seeing the entire water column because remember, you are fishing the entire water column for these fish. It's not like we're locking into the bottom like you might do with walleye during the winter months. These fish are capable predators that love to trap prey against a boundary, either the bottom of the lake or the top of the ice. Their primary prey also suspends, so these fish are conditioned to moving up and down in the water column. We talked about these fish being physostomas. They can move quickly because of that gas bladder that puts air in and out in a hurry. So we're not just focusing on one part of the water column, we are looking at all of the water column. That forward-facing sonar allows you to see those fish approach from the sides. So if you're using a live scope unit or a Mega 360, you can see them coming in from the sides. And then when you're using, again, back to the flashers, you can really get a great deal of information just on the spot you're sitting on. If you're running a chart with graphing, you can have a bathymetric real-time map and a chart that shows you where you're positioned on the structure, or you can mark those spots ahead of time in the off season in the open water period and come back in the winter. Flashers are really useful for reading bottom hardness. You might want to find a rocky area or set up on a rock point. You can read that bottom hardness in that flasher. You can also graph schools of smelt or ciscos, for example, which are a good sign that prey is inhabiting the area and lake trout won't be far behind. You do have to stay warm out there for all the reasons I laid out. That's going to either mean putting on a nice fishing suit so or your own heavy duty winter clothes so you're able to put up with the cold and the temperatures, or you're going to choose to get out there with houses and heaters if you have that opportunity. Making sure that you're doing that. And then the big thing, you're going to need a mode of transportation on most lake trout waters. With some exceptions, many lakes are not walk in a short ways and start fishing. The better your transportation options, the more invariable structure you can fish. And this is going to vary across these waters in northern Minnesota, especially if you're in boundary waters where you cannot operate a motor. So be thinking of that. Or is it going to be dog sleds? Is it going to be cross-country skis? Is it going to be snowshoes? There are a very small number of lakes that you can drive out onto with a pickup truck, but there are some places that you can do that. All right, we're getting close to the end here, folks. Before we open it up for questions and answers, just a bit about preparing lake trout for meals. They are not only a ton of fun to catch through the ice, but lake trout are exceptional eating. It's interesting when I visited other Great Lakes states, and if I catch a lake trout in Lake Michigan, most folks are returning those fish. They don't want to deal with them. They have high oil and fat content, and they're more into their introduced Pacific salmon. But me as a Minnesotan, it's like holy smokes, those lake trout are very good to eat. So begin by filleting your lake trout like you would any other fish. Cut each side of the fish off, working the knife behind the head, around the fins into the tail. You have to cut out the ribs. Make a small cut on each side of the epipleural bones. Those are those small pin bones that are left behind in a row along the fillet. So you can grill them. I like to leave the skin on and brush the meat side with olive oil and a coating of balsamic vinegar. Maybe grind on some black pepper and sea salt, and they go on the grill skin side up, or excuse me, skin side down onto the grill for 6 to 10 minutes. If you smoke your lake trout, you might have a favorite sweet or savory cure. Smoke it to a temperature of 145 degrees for half an hour. Remove them, cool them down, enjoy that treat the rest of the year. Take it with you on your other ice fishing trips. Take it with you when you travel. And so while I do prefer grilling or smoking, since these lake trout tend to be oily fish, you can bake or fry them. To bake them, try some lemon, dill, and butter, salt and pepper, and tinfoil for 20 minutes at 375 degrees. And then if you fry your fish, try cooking them unbreaded in oil with a dusting of lemon pepper and some fresh squeezed lemons on top. And I'll leave you with a little bit of conservation advice here. So these fish, we've said it already, people love chasing these fish. They're a ton of fun. The inland Minnesota lake trout limit is 2 fish. On Superior, you can keep 3 fish during the season. Some individual water bodies are considering moves to a single fish limit to protect native lake trout stocks and to prevent overharvest. So while some might consider a 1 or 2 fish limit overly conservative, it's important to remember that lake trout are a top level predator. They live in cold water and grow slowly, and they're long lived and take several years to reach sexual maturity. They're more susceptible for that reason to overharvest. Recent genetic work has shown in places where lake trout are stocked with little natural reproduction that there has been little impact on the existing gene pool, and native fish have fared best in passing on their genetics within those populations. So to protect these resilient natural lake trout populations while facing threats like invasive species, introduced fish competition and climate change, reducing harvest through a decreased bag limit is one strategy that could help with keeping these fish in the fish community. They are a long-lived fish species, another reason to take good care of them. Wisconsin DNR sampled a lake trout near the Apostle Islands in 4 different decades that was at least 46 years old and may have been as old as 70. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, also in Lake Superior, reported sampling a 70-year-old lake trout. And for everyone's information, the average lake trout takes 7 or 8 years to reach sexual maturity. When we're handling those fish, handle them carefully. Don't let your fish freeze up, particularly the eyes or fins. If you plan to release fish, do so quickly. Wet your hands to keep the slime coat intact. Don't grab the gills or grasp the gill plates too tightly. Hold those fish horizontally if you plan to release them. And I'll just mention there is a discussion of a catch and release lake trout record opportunity coming in the future. Stay tuned for that. Maybe you can be the person to catch a modern day catch and release giant trophy lake trout. With that, I know it was a lot of information in a short amount of time, but we do record these seminars. So if we need to go back and see something, hopefully it's all there for you. I will take questions.
Great, Scott. That was a lot of awesome information, and you always cover the food part, so now I'm hungry. So for those of you listening, I did open the poll. So if you want to open the polling, again, it's down the bottom right hand corner, and participate in our polling questions. And appreciate that. We always like to have some participation in that. So, had a few questions that came in. Jeff was wondering, does time of day impact lake trout as much as it does for walleyes, for example?
So it's going to be a kind of a personal question. I will say that in my experience, I've done most of my lake trout fishing in in daylight hours. I know that you can catch fish after dark and at night. I don't see this species as particularly crepuscular, meaning that they're keyed in like a walleye is on low light periods at sunrise and sunset. I have seen flurries of lake trout activity right away at first light. I've seen mid-morning, late morning, the lull around lunchtime, and then all of a sudden it picks up dramatically and we get a bunch of fish that push through. It can be afternoon, it can be right before dark. I've really seen a little bit of everything, but it's also been daylight hours. And in fairness, I haven't put a lot of time into nighttime fishing like some other anglers have. However, being that they are a visual predator, what is known about their vision is they do best in light situations where so typically in daylight hours.
Great. Scott was wondering, I'm getting curious in this one too. Between my dad and I have been fishing the same lake for nearly 60 years, large lake, 150 feet deep. You can catch 15 Lakers a day. The fish are all the same size and small, 20 to 24 inches. Have always been this size. Is that a specific strain or is it a lack of feed? What do you think's going on there?
Good question. I would encourage you to reach out to your local fisheries office in that respective region. I know that I've experienced lake trout waters that are like that. There are great differences from location to location. When it comes to total size and abundance, a lot of times the controls that are occurring for that can be a part of forage. Absolutely, it can be what the abundance looks like. They can be super abundant, small. I probably can't go as far as saying stunted, but those offices that have the data could. So that's my best piece of advice, is just reaching out to those local offices to ask those specific questions, just because they're going to be really keyed in from sampling and having all that data.
Great. And they can find that on the DNR site. If you just look for fisheries offices, you'll be able to pull up a list of all of them out there, and
Well,
feel free to
well,
reach out to them.
yeah, while Benji's looking up the next question, I'll just get a couple quick hitters that were in the chat. Do kids under 16 need a trout stamp? No, they do not. Is there any size restriction for the size of the hole? Minnesota does not have that. I know Wisconsin has a hole limit. Just make sure if you're cutting a big hole, if you want to say you're cutting a hole in shallow water to sight fish lake trout that are coming up on a reef or something, just make sure that you're marking that hole and you're not creating a safety issue. When I say marking it, I'm talking about pull some branches and some wood, keep your ice block, whatever it is.
Great. Colton was asking about if there's a website for ice thickness. I don't know of one, and ice thickness is always changing. So, what's your
Well,
best advice?
yeah, so a couple things on that. No, you'll hear it from our agency. No ice is safe ice. There's always risks involved. I think your best bet are to contact local bait shops if you don't have someone to talk to firsthand. There's a certain amount of risk involved no matter what. There is an app out there for ice thickness. I know I've looked at it out of just general curiosity, but I'm not sure I want to trust someone else's word. I can put a little more stock into bait shops or fishing guides, but always be careful when you're heading out there.
Yeah. Chris asks, at what depth do you fish for lake trout both winter and summer? We covered that a little bit. They vary all over.
So when it's summertime, we're talking about stratification. These lakes set up with a epilimnion on the top of warm water that's well oxygenated, a metalimnion in the middle where the thermocline is, and that's where you see this rapid change from warm water to cold water, and also where your oxygen starts to drop out. So you need to, pick your spots, trying to fish down to a certain depth, and where that thermocline and metalimnion, where that breaking point is for oxygen, where that lies exactly is dependent from lake to lake. So early in the summer, you start off shallow and then you go deeper and deeper typically. But they can be really all over in that upper layer as long as they have enough oxygen. But they do retreat into the colder water just because they prefer cold temperatures. That's the summer answer I'd give you. Winter, I mean, they can be anywhere, but that's why I like to pull up on structure. I like to go anywhere from 20 to 40 feet, sometimes as deep as 60 feet. But when I fished on Lake Superior, I was catching fish at 150 feet of water. So you just never know.
Adam's got a great question too, and I'd like to expand on it a little bit. But does a Vexlar count as a motor in regards to the BWCA, where
It
motors
does not.
aren't allowed?
No, flashers do not
But
count. Folks bring them in for use, and I understand. Everyone has their own thoughts on what level of mechanization you want. Folks that leave cell phones behind and leave modern devices behind, electronics included, that's if folks want to do that, absolutely. But by law you don't have to leave a flasher or electronics behind.
there is some regulations. We had to question another episode about augers, and battery operated electric augers
Yep.
are
Do
not
not.
allowed, right?
Yep, it's all hand augers. Do not bring a gas or electric auger into the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. Know where your boundaries are for operation of that equipment.
It's a good way to stay warm punching holes with a hand auger. So
Yeah.
Andy's wondering, he's heard this, the lake trout bite is super tough on grindstone near Hinckley, which refers to another question. I think that's the most southern lake trout lake we have, possibly grindstone in Hinckley.
Yes.
But have you fished that at all? And would you give any tips for that lake?
I fished it back in college because we could run off of the St. Paul campus and run to northern Minnesota to Grindstone. I've only fished it once. It is very tough. We tried to set up, we marked a few fish through, and also we could not get them to bite. So do tune in to the folks at the Hinckley Fisheries office. I know a number of them have fished on Grindstone, can give you some tips there. Actually, we ended up catching a lot of smelt that day, and they were bigger smelt, so we kept some of the smelt to eat. But yeah, that is kind of our southernmost lake trout lake, but there's a lot of other ones. I know folks in the chat are asking about, where to go and where to check that, where to find a lake trout lake. Um, I don't have I don't have a smoking gun to send everybody to try here or try there, but consult that list and start learning them. On your own, venture onto a lake, try it out, learn what you can. Get to know a water body, and then if it isn't producing for you, try another one. You can hire a fishing guide to learn something about a water body, and you can steepen that learning curve.
Yeah, I think we just ran out of time, but Jeff had a good question here about the DNR does the DNR have good success with sampling, or are lake trout pretty difficult to sample? Do you want to touch on that real quick, or?
That's a great question. They are very challenging to sample, both on Superior and in inland waters. We do turn to, we've got some long-term monitoring lakes that include lake trout, and we have, we do attempt different things with gill nets. They're our best measure for these fish. We suspend them. So think about being over 80 foot of water and having a gill net that's down 20 feet, 40 feet, 60 feet. We try to have some representation through the water column, but we're also looking at, in the summertime when those gill nets are set, where that water sets up when it's stratified, like I was describing earlier. So we're not going to set it down where there isn't enough available oxygen, but we can suspend them at different depths and try to get a little bit of an idea. It's challenging. We have our own questions about if we have representative sampling. But typically through a few different sampling techniques and gears, we can get a little bit of an idea. We can also, do an angler survey in Creole Lake and find out what harvest looks like on lake trout, angler harvest. And we can also kind of look at growth on these fish, although it's more challenging because they are so slow growing.
Great. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Our chat is blowing up with thank yous and appreciation for your presentation today, Scott. We really appreciate you joining us. And thanks again for pointing out this weekend is Take a Kid Ice Fishing Weekend. Get out there on the ice if you can. We are having a tough ice season around Minnesota, and I think the whole upper Midwest this year with our kind of cold temperature and then warmer temperature and that wet slushy snow we got. There's a lot of slush and stuff on the ice, and it's pretty thin in spots. So be careful, be safe out there. Check with your local regulations, local bait shops, DNR offices if you want, and get the information you can before you head out. But we will be out there. Scott will be up north chasing lake trout. I will be probably out in Lake Nokomis chasing some panfish for Take a Kid Ice Fishing Weekend. And I'd welcome anybody to join us. Hopefully you can get out, enjoy the nice weather, and introduce a new person to ice fishing. So thanks,
Thanks, everyone.
everybody. we'll see you next week for, I was going to look that up and I forgot. Shed hunting. We're doing shed hunting next week, so that'll be another interesting one. So I think with that, we'll end the recording. Have a safe week, everybody. Appreciate you joining us, and I think with that, Craig, we can hop to the back room.